Yeah, this talk actually, the last time I gave it was at Pringle Hall about probably 7 years ago to a watershed council group put it together, and they wanted a talk on wildflowers and naturescaping. So I kind of combined a couple of talks into one that cover areas to explore, and then some of it has to do with like actually growing some plants in your garden if you're interested in natives for your own garden. So just a little bit about how this talk came about. In the early 2000s, I was just out of college and I had done my internship at the Ray Selling Berry Botanic Garden, and they ended up hiring me on as the propagator. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Berry Botanic Garden, I've talked about this place quite a bit since it was pretty influential in my career. It was the home of Ray Selling Berry. Her husband was the director of the Port of Portland, so they were a pretty affluent early 1900s couple in the Dunthorpe neighborhood. I always say Edith and Elizabeth had to have known them because they did a bunch of gardens right around this area in the Dunthorpe area there. But while I was working at the garden, I was in charge of putting together what's called an index seminum. And index seminums are what botanical gardens do to basically curate and exchange plants and germplasm, basically genetics with each other. So kind of like what zoos do with, oh, if you have a rare breeding pair of some animal, that they'll share, you know, offspring with other zoos to kind of keep the thing in cultivation. Botanical gardens publish index seminums where they trade seed with each other. And so the Berry Botanic Garden did one, and I was in charge of essentially curating the native wild collected seeds that were on there. A lot of botanical gardens want wild collected source material because it's not influenced by cultivated genetics. So I basically had a permit with the Forest Service and the BLM to go seed collecting all around Oregon on either BLM or Forest Service land. And I got to travel all over.
Oh, wait a minute, let me go get my coffee.
Or college student at the time, or just out of college, you know, and like the college student loans come and due and everything. So backpacking and car camping was actually a pretty cheap way to kind of spend weekends. So it was fun. I got to see a lot of Oregon. At the time, I was also really interested in native plants. So in this, can you guys see the cursor?
Yes.
Not okay, cool. So I can point out stuff. So I started cultivating a lot of native plants with an eye toward xeriscaping, so low to zero water use. And a lot of the plants I was looking at were alpine plants. So this talk says Wildflower Adventures Around Oregon, and I am going to talk a little bit about the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which is in Washington. It's just right across the border. So, but we're going to cover the Kalmiopsis Wilderness, the Coast Range, the Cascades, over to the Ochocos, and the Blue Mountains and the Wallowas in this talk. So I have since been to the Steens Mountains, which is right down here. But I didn't really go at a time when the wildflowers were in bloom. But we're going to start really close to home here. So this, if you're familiar with this area, Parish Gap, the grade school I went to, Cloverdale Elementary, is right here. I-5 is on your left. This is what's called Summit Loop, if you know the area around here. So just starting out close to home, this was some property that my ex-in-laws had owned. They had about a 25-acre sheep farm out there. And I bring this up because they had some really great wildflowers on it, and it was grazed land. But what they did, they were very responsible about rotational grazing, which is really important when you're talking about saving wildflowers. A lot of the areas I'm going to cover in here, because they were BLM land, it's open range grazing, especially when you get out in Eastern Oregon. So what these folks did with their sheep farm here is they rotated the grazing, and they had like a summer and a spring and a fall and a winter pasture. And they would move this sheep around to be able, so they were never grazing. And these folks knew about Wildflowers because I was involved with, you know, letting them know all the stuff they had there. They were pretty savvy about it. So this is just Lithophragma parviflorum in the spring. It's a really beautiful show out there. Delphinium, Natalii, of course, hopefully everybody should be able to recognize poison oak from 10,000 feet away, right? There's poison oak all over in there, but one of the native delphiniums. So they had a lot of checker mallows growing on the property too. And I'm going to talk really fast because I want to get through all these slides if I can. So I'm going to probably try to cruise as quick as possible here. So this is one of the endangered Nelson's checker mallow. There's actually a population of that at the Salem airport. And it's been one of the reasons that they've had to they have had difficulties expanding the runway, is that this rare plant grows there. But there are a few ones that aren't rare that you can cultivate, like Nelsoniana and Cusickii. And these are nice because they bloom in kind of the later season after a lot of the early season flowers are done. These actually start blooming in like June. So we're going to head up into the Cascades now, and this is unfortunately one of the areas that was badly burned in this summer's wildfires, but we're going to go up Highway 22 and talk about a couple of areas up there. And I haven't got to go explore all the wildflower spots, but I think a lot of these places have been pretty devastated. But along the stream sides, one of the orchids that you'll see in there, Epipactis gigantea, the giant stream helleborine, it's called. It's always growing with its feet in the water. The rare one that most people haven't seen, Scoliopus bigelovii, comes from the redwood belt. So it's southern Oregon into northern California, but this is the one that's around here, Scoliopus hollii. And most people haven't seen it. Even pretty astute wildflower folks haven't seen it because it comes up and it blooms in February. And it's pretty much gone by the end of March. It's a spring ephemeral, kind of like erythronium. It has a real short bloom time, blooms in the winter, and then by the time things even start to leaf out and dry out, it's totally gone. So it's only above ground for about a month, 2 months out of the year. So most people have never seen Scoliopus, but it's called the fetid adder's tongue. It's a real stinky smelling. It's pollinated by beetles, so it's a smelly flower. It's in the iris family. Some of the pretty wildflower shows you can get up on, like going up Highway 22. This is right above the river at Idana, and I've been up there to ski a few times. Idana is still there. Most of Detroit was, of course, burned, but this is the show above the river right at Idana. There's some really good fly fishing holes in the river there, the Santiam River. So the little blue wildflowers are Collinsia parviflora, and they make a great annual show. Another little blue flower that you're going to see quite a bit up there is Nemophila menziesii. And then, of course, if you're interested in hummingbirds, this is a good annual to try to sow in your garden every year. Hypomopsis. They've since, I think, changed it to Gelia aggregata, but a really good native wildflower for hummingbirds. Valerian, if anybody knows about herbal remedies and stuff, valerian root is a pretty popular one for nighttime calming. We have a native valerian that grows up there called Valeriana schooleri, and it's a showy little wildflower. It smells really fragrant too. The penstemons, a lot of different penstemon species grow in the Cascades, and there's different color forms. This is probably one of the showiest ones, Penstemon rupicola. Grows in the real rocky crevices and just makes an absolutely beautiful show up there. This is Tumble Lake. I went up there last year. These are some more modern shots. A lot of the photos in this talk were taken, oh gosh, 18, 20 years ago. So they're still film and they've been transferred to digital. So, and I was never that great of a film camera guy. I really appreciate digital because you're able to manipulate and kind of clean up your mistakes. So some of these photos are better than others. But this is the Tumble Lake Trail. If you've ever been up there, it's above Detroit Lake, and there's just some really fantastic native rock gardens. I'm scared to think of what it looks like now, because I think this was an area that was burned heavily. The fire kind of raged right down from there into the Little North Fork Canyon. And so this area may be all gone now. I took these pictures last May, and beautiful just shows of wildflowers, Areophyllum linatum, Oregon sunshine it's called. Of course, we all know Oregon sunshine as rain, right? Liquid rain falling from the sky these days. But heading over the pass, Clarkia amowina. I just wanted to talk about this wildflower a little bit, because in the cultivating world, if you're growing native plants in your gardens, this is a good one, like a really great native wildflower. But the one that you're really going to see more in like restoration sites around here is Clarkia purpurea. And it's a little less showy than amowina. It tends to have a little bit of a smaller flower, but this is at the Fairview mitigation. And when you're using plants in restoration areas like this, you really have to kind of think about the genetics and more the wild type, as opposed to the showy like garden cultivar that everybody knows as Farewell to Spring.
I've had that.
So heading east now, we're over the pass and we're into an area called the Crooked River Gorge. If anybody knows like Smith Rock area, that's the Crooked River that flows through there. But this is a little bit further up towards the dam, and you can just tell by the topography, it's a pretty dramatic show. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's these really cool basalt cut headlands with just really amazing topography in there. And there's a whole slew of BLM campgrounds that are, at the time they were free. And I don't know, it's been a while, but it's known as a really good fly fishing tailwater. And so that's part of the reason I would spend a lot of time out there. But there's a lot of little great rock garden species that grow out there in the drier desert. It's kind of the high desert area. So Erigeron being one of them. Astragalus species are really pretty showy. Now these are known as loco weeds, and they're really toxic. They're toxic. Apparently they would cause cattle that ingested them to kind of go crazy and start behaving erratic. So hence the name loco weed. But there's something like 500 different species of Astragalus. They have a pea type flower, and there's some really, really showy ones actually. I don't know if I'm gonna have time to do it in this speaking series or not, but I did go to Death Valley during the 2005, it was a 100-year bloom when the desert wildflowers were just amazingly showy. And there's a couple of the really showy species from the Death Valley area are these two. But I'll show some more in this talk, because they're a pretty common ubiquitous wildflower in the West. And again, to just kind of bring back that grazing theme, you'll see them a lot of places that are heavily grazed. This might be the only flower blooming there because they are toxic to cattle. A little allium onions that Pam mentioned, my flower bulb nursery, Illahee Rare Bulbs. I've always kind of been interested in bulbous plants, and especially because of that xeric thing. Just to talk a little bit about the biology, if you're dealing with drought, summer drought, one of the highest forms of plant adaptation to that is to lose its leaves and go underground, to just be stored in a bulb over the summer, the dry summer, because roots and leaves basically act as a straw. They're sucking up water from the ground, and then the leaves are transpirating it out to the atmosphere. So that's using water. If you dry up to just a bulb and you're not using any water, that's about as xeric a plant as you can get. So not all bulbs are completely xeriscape plants, but the bulk of them, that adaptation, the geophyte going underground to a bulbous plant, is an adaptation to summer dry to be able to survive drought. So that's a pink form. There's a white form. There's a lot of different variants of allium told me that you'll see out there. Phlox cespitosa. This is one that's pretty good garden plant. A lot of people like to grow phloxes in their garden, and a number of the hybrids that are available are based on our Western native species. So this is Phlox cespitosa in the Crooked River Gorge. We're actually a little bit higher up into the mountains now because you don't see this in the Crooked River Gorge area, but this is one of the lady slipper orchids. Pretty rare. It's a tough plant to find, actually. This photo was taken an area of Mount Hood called Flag Point, and really dramatic wildflower. That thing's like 3 feet tall, and those are huge lady slippers.
Wow.
So really beautiful, very rare, collected. A lot of these rare wildflowers have been, collected because people were interested in it. And I never did get seed of this. It's kind of considered ungrowable, or it's difficult to cultivate because of, there's like, with orchids, there's a lot of the symbiotic relationship that goes on with their seed having to germinate on mycorrhizae, and it's pretty tricky. But the other one I've run across in my wildflower adventures is Calceolus, the yellow lady slipper. And I'll show one more from the Kalmiopsis wilderness a little bit later. So one of my favorite areas is the John Day fossil beds. If you have not been there, I think should be on anybody's like top list of places to see in Oregon. It's just, the geology is fascinating, and the views, and it's just a really neat area. So this actually covers a couple of areas. This is the Ochiko mountain range. It's kind of a small minor mountain range. And there's a really good pass right here, Ochiko Pass, and there's campgrounds up there. But going over the divide, you get into a lot of neat alpine plants, and then eventually you come down into the John Day fossil beds. So in here you can see this is Black Butte right here, and this photo is me long time ago standing by that's Black Butte in the background. So this is the top of the Ochiko Pass, and there's some neat little wildflowers up there. This is evening primrose. That's Onothera breviflora. Hard to find the flowers open because they kind of do that only open in the evening or on overcast days, but they're pretty big flower when they're open on a tiny little rosette. The monkey flowers, I've always had an interest in monkey flowers since I did some early published work on breeding different monkey flowers and propagating monkey flowers. So this is just one of the annuals from out there. And Cusick was a botanist who explored a lot of Oregon in I think he was here late 1800s, early 1900s, really more like late 1800s. But you'll see his name come up a lot because he covered a lot of ground in Oregon. He's got a lot of like native plants named for him. So one of the coolest things about the John Day fossil beds is really some of the dramatic like rock, the outcrops and stuff. And just to me, that looks like a castle almost, like just really interesting. But the fossil beds themselves are sort of divided up into different units, and the Clarno unit has quite a number of rare plants actually in it. There's a pedicactus that's out there. I never did find it in bloom. And out of bloom, it's just a little small barrel cactus, but there's some rare cactus that grow out there. The Painted Hills, this I think is probably that must-see part of Oregon. If you haven't been out there, you got to put it on your list. So just a little bit about the geology. This was apparently a lake back in the prehistoric era, I guess. I don't know exactly the time frame, but all these different strata in the rocks here kind of represent, it was eruptions like Mount Mazama. Some of the big like Cascade volcanoes would erupt and lay ash layers down, and as the lake eventually went away, that left these stratas. And a lot of them are really interesting. Like the red is super high in iron. I've been told the yellow is super high in sulfur content from some of the volcanism, but really, really neat area to see. So one of the cool little wildflowers that grows out there is Cleome platycarpa. Probably a lot of you know Cleome because we grow it here in the garden at Gaiety Hollow. The big bee plant it's called, big, huge heads. This one's pretty small. It's a diminutive, but nice little showy wildflower. And I've heard that it has it's almost always growing on this super yellow substrate, and it seems to have a high tolerance for sulfur in the soil, which sulfur soils are super acidic. So if you're trying to raise your pH, you add limestone. If you want to lower the pH of a soil, sulfur is an amendment that's usually added. So this is along the John Day River. I used to go with a group of friends every year. There's a wild and scenic river trail that you can do. It's about a 30-mile float. I'm a wooden boat guy, so there's my little Mackenzie River square ender. These are non-native. I talk a little bit about the fish. The John Day River has one of the highest densities of smallmouth bass per river mile anywhere in the US. And they're not native. They were introduced, but it's a really interesting fishery in that it hasn't seemed to impact the native salmon run there because of the timing of it. But the John Day it's an undammed river, one of the largest undammed rivers in the U.S. and in Oregon for sure. But it's really subject to well, they do a lot of grazing out there, and they also grow a lot of alfalfa out there. So there's no dam to kind of regulate the flow in the river. So once the farmers start irrigating the alfalfa fields there, that river just drops. And so it's only floatable for a few months of the year in the warm months. Basically, about the 4th of July, they suck all the water out and it becomes kind of unfloatable. So this is the one big rapid that's on the river there. It's called Burnt Ranch Rapid. And here's another year, a different year. That's one of my boats there. And you can see that same rapid is totally runnable one year, but because of the drop in irrigation, it's just a boulder garden. So it's a pretty neat area that you can float in, and there's these really dramatic like cut canyons, but it's wilderness because it's a wild and scenic river. So there's not really any roads that get out there, but some pretty neat bulbs that grow out there. This is Calochortus macrocarpus. It's one of the Mariposa lilies. It's a really great bulbous species and one of the best for real dry land cultivation. The Oregon Garden, I've ordered a bunch of Calochortus from my bulb nursery this year. I guess they're really interested in expanding the Calochortus collection out there. So pretty beautiful bulb. It's about 2.5 feet tall and pink, huge like goblet shaped flowers, just really beautiful and dramatic. And they bloom at this late June, early July when all the grasses have died back. So it puts on a real good show. So moving over one drainage now, this is kind of really interesting. If you know Oregon, you know the John Day and the Deschutes River are two pretty big, well-known rivers. And it's weird that they're separated only by like 20 or 30 miles, but they're so completely different in their aspects. One is huge rapids, the Deschutes, it's French word meaning the falls, right? And so this is along the Deschutes River now. This is an Amsynchia, one of the borage family wildflowers. And then this is a Brodea making quite a show, Brodea elegans. So if you know the Deschutes, it's really famous for its hatches of the giant salmon fly, Pteronarches californica. That is a almost 4-inch long fly. It's huge. And it's the reason why the trout grow so big in there. So that's, if you go in the spring to look at wildflowers, you'll see it just loaded with fishermen. There's a type of trout in there known as the red band rainbow. It's kind of a species, specific, pretty specific to that drainage and the eastern drainages. But the red band rainbows are on the Deschutes. It's pretty famous. And there's also the California golden stonefly, and then this is the giant salmon fly. And sometimes you'll find them at the same time along the Deschutes River. So just a little bit further west of the John Day and the Deschutes River, you get into a pretty interesting area. And I'm going to go across the river into Washington a little bit here. The Columbia Hills, this is the town of the Dalles, the city of the Dalles. Across from there, this Stacker Butte right here, you can drive up it says 4-wheel drive roads, but there's a pretty good road that takes you up to the top of this Stacker Butte, what's kind of known as the Dalles Mountain. And there's some pretty interesting wildflowers that occur out there. So I mentioned the loco weeds. Here's another astragalus, similar to Raventiformis. The big-headed clover, this one, people are familiar with clover in their lawns, but if you've ever seen the big-headed clover, Trifolium macrocephalum, they're like twice the size of a golf ball. So they're huge, like really big flowers, pretty dramatic, and they're really quite showy, but that's a neat one that grows out on Dalles Mountain. Phoenicallis charantoides, this is the dagger pod. The seed pods form these really long dagger-like pods, hence the common name, but it's a real popular one with rock gardeners because it's really showy. A lot of this, you have to remember, the Barry Botanic Garden had a specialty in alpine flora. At one point, it was the largest public rock garden on the West Coast. And so it was sort of the focus of a lot of these travels were plants that were gardens. Delphinium natalianum, the one I showed before was natalii. This is natalianum, so this is a different species. This is kind of a little bit of a rare one that grows up there. And of course, everybody knows the show of delphiniums at Gaiety Hollow. Most of those genetics are based on the Chinese ones, the taller, really showy ones. Most of our delphiniums here, our native ones, are a lot smaller statured and not quite that big, showy, dramatic kind of thing that you see in Gaiety Hollow in the early summer. There's a lot of really great phloxes out there. Phlox is one that's really popular with rock gardeners, and it's a very xeric plant. Like, you can put phlox in a bed, and as long as you get it established the first year, you'll never have to water it, and it'll reward you with a good show. So lots of neat phloxes out that way. So just I thought I'd mention a couple of the best wildflower spots in the Columbia River Gorge. And I don't actually have, I had Dalles Mountain there, but I need to go back to Catherine Creek and get some better photos and update this talk. But if you've never been to the Catherine Creek Natural Area, it's one of the best wildflower spots. There's really good, easy to hike on trail up there. And it's really known for its show of Cicerynchium, and they're called grass widows, the pink Cicerynchiums, and Lewisia rediviva. So this is just, I'm going to mention a couple of areas in the gorge that have a few rare plants that maybe people haven't seen. And this one is kind of considered a holy grail of rock gardening plants, Douglasia levigata. And this is a bad photo of it, and that there's an explanation behind that. This is zoomed in really far. And the reason is because where this is growing in the gorge, where you could get to it easily, it's been collected. People have pulled it out of the rocks to take it and grow it. And so most places where it's easily accessible, it's been anything above, where people can either climb to or grab, has been completely collected. So I found it in spots where I could get to and take a good photo of it, but it's related to the primroses and the primrose family, and it makes a really great little tufted cushion plant. And obviously you can kind of tell from the area it's growing on. It grows on cliffs. So if you find a plant that grows on cliffs in the Columbia River Gorge, is a pretty good bet. It's really drought tolerant in the summer, because if you've ever been out there when the wind is blowing at like it's 80 degrees and the wind's blowing at 40 miles an hour in Hood River and people are doing the windsurfing or the kiteboarding. It's kind of like being, you know, the plant's got a hairdryer on it for 4 months of the year. So a few other plants from those little rockery areas. The Sitka mist maidens, I thought that's a cool little common name, but Romanzophia sitchensis, the Sitka mist maiden, they make really great little spring shows, and especially growing with sedums. There's been a huge rise in the popularity of succulents. If you go, you know, just anywhere nowadays, people are selling succulents like crazy, and actually these two are some of the best little native ones. Romanzophia is a pretty succulent little plant, kind of got these little juicy little leaves here. But again, cliff dwellers, if you don't grow sedum organense, you can grow that thing in gravel. It doesn't need any water in the summer, super drought tolerant. Okay, so I mentioned the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, and I think I'm doing okay on time. I'm going pretty quick here. This is gonna, I should probably change the title to Wildflower Adventures in Washington, but I haven't done a ton of exploring up there yet. But one of my favorite areas, just to orient yourself, this is Mount Adams right here, the Mount Adams Wilderness, and this is obviously here's the Columbia River Gorge, white salmon. You go across Bridge of the Gods and you kind of can head up into some really interesting areas around Trout Lake. There's the Camas show in the spring is unbelievable at Bird Creek Meadows. And then if you go a little bit later in the summer, there's Little Huckleberry and Big Huckleberry Mountain. And these areas are actually peat bogs interspersed with kind of mountainous, and then draining into these little peat bogs. So there's some really interesting plants there. And then the Indian Heaven Wilderness is, here's to orient, the Big Huckleberry Mountain and Little Huckleberry Mountain. And the Indian Heaven Wilderness was an area that actually the Native Americans, it was pretty sacred to them. A bunch of tribes used to gather there every fall for like a big rendezvous, and they would compete. There's a racetrack. They used to do like foot races and horse races. Excuse me. But it's also one of the things they were doing was stocking up on berries for the winter, because Indian Heaven is one of the best huckleberry picking areas you can imagine around here. And actually, if you go in September, late summer, early fall, you'll see commercial harvesters coming out, and actually found a commercial harvesting tool for picking huckleberries up there. But I went botanizing up there with these are three just amazing people. This is Jack Poff, was Mrs. Berry's gardener back towards the end of her life. So he started working for her, I think, in the 60s, the 1960s, and he was kind of like Kurt was for Edith and Elizabeth here at the garden. That was Mrs. Berry's gardener. This character here, Meredith, he was actually the caretaker at the Leach Botanical Garden. If anybody's been to the Leach Botanical Garden, he was the guy that lived there and made sure, like at night, things were safe and put away. And he's a carnivorous plant expert. I like when you're going botanizing or checking out wildflowers, one of the best things you can do is to go with people that are smarter than you. I found that with anything in life. It's like surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, because you'll inevitably kind of pick up on it. So this guy, Dave Peterson, he owned a fern nursery. I actually worked for them as an estate gardener for a time in Portland. So he was a fern expert. This guy was a carnivorous plant expert. And then Jack Poff, having worked for Mrs. Berry, was just a phenomenal plant specialist. So that, it's hard to see. It's washed out. That's Mount Adams in the background. And where we're standing here is called Bird Creek Meadows. There's some cool little hike. You can walk out to some interpretive boardwalks and stuff. But out there is just an amazing show. The camas fields at Bird Creek Meadows are some of those untouched, kind of like you get the descriptions in the Lewis and Clark journals where they talk about being able to see, you know, it looked like they thought they were almost in an ocean or a lake because it was solid blue purple. But one of the taller irises that grows out there is Iris missouriensis. That's a good native wildflower to have. These bogs that are at Bird Creek Meadows is really a bog, is what it is, a giant bog. And there's some pretty neat plants that grow out there. This is the habenaria orchid, the bog rain orchid. These are like 3 feet tall, so they're real dramatic, showy, pretty orchid. Almost impossible to cultivate though. The Mimulus primuloides, the primrose monkey flower, this is one of my favorites. It makes a little mat forming species, and most monkey flowers are almost always growing where it's wet, in like little seeps and moist areas. And this just shows kind of the form of the primrose monkey flower. It has these little rosettes on stolons, and it's kind of unique for that in the genus, but really good plant for wet, like moist rock garden. So Calochortus, again, being the bulb grower, these have special interest for me. And they got for some reason, Calochortus got a reputation as being kind of hard to grow, difficult to grow. So a lot of people consider them like, they're not very common in the landscape or nursery trade. And I don't know why, because they're not that hard to grow. They actually will flower really quickly from seed. This is a good one. It's a cat's ear. There's like different types. There's the Mariposa lilies. There's the cat's ears. It's divided into like 4 different distinct subgenre, but the cat's ears ones are a really great one. And for scale reference, that's me taking a photo of it. So that's how big it is. You can kind of get an idea of the habitat, drier woodlands up above the bogs. Viola adunca, this is one of the cool native purple violets. Most of our native violets are yellow, and this is one of the purple ones. Is super fragrant too. If you ever run across patches of this, it's really, it's got a wonderful fragrance to it. So this is just for like time scale reference. That little girl in the backpack is heading off to college now. She's filling out her college application. So this was a long time ago, but this was one of her first backpacking trips into Indian heaven. And I mentioned the commercial huckleberry harvester. These are the huckleberries. There's like 3 different types of huckleberries and wild blueberries that grow in the Indian heaven wilderness. And it's hard to tell, but that's a little harvester we found on the side of the trail. But you would see people walking out with backpacks, similar to when in the mushroom harvest season, if you've ever seen commercial mushroom harvesters in the Coast Range. If you go to Indian Heaven in September, you'll see people walking out with backpacks, like huge. And to put it in reference, sometimes wild huckleberries go for like $36 a pound. I mean, I've seen them anywhere from $18 to $36 a pound. And I've seen people hiking out with backpacks that must have been 100 pounds of wild huckleberries. So the jury's out on these little harvesters, because it's basically a little metal box. I should have brought it in. It's a little metal box with a handle, and it's got tines, and you rake it through, and it pulls all the berries off. And these guys, the commercial harvesters, they just go through and and they actually strip a lot of the leaves off the plants. And I've always wondered if that is probably detrimental in the long run. But anyway, if you're interested in a huckleberry spot, the Indian Heaven Wilderness is the spot to go. So this is Little Huckleberry Mountain in the background, and this is the bog. It's like 6 inches of standing water over peat, and of course Kalmia growing out there, the bog laurel. It's really showy plant, beautiful. Menianthes trifoliata. There you can get an idea of what you're doing. You got to bring rubber boots because you're walking in this just like, you know, it's basically peat bogs with standing water. Drosera. So this is a little carnivorous plant. For those of you know, I do a lot of talks to local kids here when we can do educational stuff about carnivorous plant biology. This is one of the natives that grows out there. It's a sundew. So it has those sticky little tentacles, basically glue traps, and flies land on there and they get stuck and essentially digested. Meredith, the fella I mentioned earlier, he was really interested in looking at the different carnivorous plants in this area. And there was a number of them. There's a fully aquatic one called a nutricularia, the bladderwort. So it grows underwater, and essentially it's a little bladder that has a trigger on it. And when a bug swims by, it hits that trigger, and kind of like a Venus flytrap, but in opposite, it opens, and when it opens, the vacuum sucks in the bug and it ends up trapped in the stomach and it gets digested. So there's 3 different types of carnivorous plants that grow in the Gifford Pinchot. There's pinguiculas, which are butterworts. There's the droseras, which are sundews, and then the utricularia, which are bladderworts. But pretty interesting it's an interesting area, and I would highly recommend you check it out. So the native peony, hopefully everybody knew we had a native peony here, right? Looks nothing like the big showy peonies we grow in our gardens, but this is Peonia brownii. It's really hard to cultivate. I have it growing at my house from seed that I collected 20 years ago, and it only ever puts out a few little flowers, but I don't think anybody would really call it an ugly duckling, but those are just little brownish yellow green bracts. It's pretty highly sought after by collectors because it's kind of rare and unusual, and it actually has this really showy glass foliage, but that's our native peony there. So heading now further east to the Wallowa Mountains, I was actually skiing in the Elkhorn Mountains. I haven't botanized in the Elkhorns, but I've skied. I skied them, and so you could see from where Baker City's right about here, and you can look over at Eagle Cap and the Wallowa Mountains. And this is, to me, it's like the Alps of Oregon. If you haven't seen the Wallowas, this needs to go to the top of your list of places. Joseph is a really cool town that's out there. Has it's a kind of like a enclave for artists. There's a bronze foundry out there. So you're driving through these little tiny Eastern Oregon towns, and you come into the city of Joseph, and all of a sudden there's these like really cool bronze artworks and stuff, and it's neat. But botanically, it's pretty interesting. So the areas that I've explored are that should say Imnaha. Sorry, that's missing an N. The Eagle Cap and Coosac Mountain. So this area is really well known for its rock garden plants. Mrs. Berry was really fascinated by a primrose that grew out there. I never caught it in bloom. You have to go. It's a snowmelt species. It grows way up high at the alpine level, and it's only in bloom and above ground again when like in this short little window of time. So it was Primula cousackiana, and it's super fragrant. It's a really cool primrose. I should add a picture in here if I can at some point, but that was what I was looking for. I never found it, but found some other cool things. So Corydalus caesiana, variety cousickii. The first time I saw this plant, I was absolutely blown away. I didn't know we had a native Corydalus that grew here. And this is like 6 foot tall. This is a huge plant, big dramatic flower stalks. And I thought, wow, how have I not even heard of this plant? That's the Imnaha River in the background there. Really showy. Like I mentioned, these things can be up to 6 feet tall. Absolutely beautiful. So when I first saw this, I was so excited. I thought, oh man, I'm going to get that plant into cultivation. I'll come back and get seeds of it. And it turns out it's considered completely ungrowable. So this is the Imnaha River is fed off of the Eagle Cap. So it's like that water is 40 degrees like year round. It's like ice cold basically. And these roots go 6 feet down and they're in the sandy layer right along the river. And basically they're submerged in ice water year round. So unless you have Snowmelt Creek in your backyard, you are not going to be able to grow Cordylis caseana variety Cusickii, but it's a beautiful wildflower. And when you see it in its native habitat, it's kind of overwhelming. So aconiitums, I did one of the blog entries on aconiitums this year because we grow them at Gaiety Hollow. Our native is Aconitum columbianum. This is from out in the Wallowas, and there's some really interesting color forms out there. They can be all the way from like dark plum purple to these almost yellow, just barely tinged kind of purple tinged flowers, which is pretty neat to see that kind of the variety that is actually available in the native. Bog St. John's wort, I just threw this one in there because Hypericum is sort of a ubiquitous. If you know landscaping in Salem, the right-of-way strips along Mission are all St. John's wort, but that's basically like a Chinese one that's really drought tolerant. This is one of the natives that grows in wet, moist bog areas. Okay, doing good on time. So Cusick Mountain, this is a fun little story. I mentioned Cusick, the botanist, William Cusick. This is a mountain that's named for him. I think it's close to 9,000 feet. You can hike in and backpack on these terraces, and then it's a scramble to get to the top of the mountain. It's not like, it doesn't require ropes or anything for rock climbing. It's more like scrambling along screes. But we were looking for some pretty rare plants at the top of this mountain and climbed it. This is the view. So this is looking out on Hell's Canyon and the Seven Devils. So that's Idaho in the background there. We got to the top of this mountain, and at the very, very summit, there was a little PVC tube with threads on each end. And I looked in it, and what it was a notepad, and everybody had for like the past 5 or 10 years just written a little journal note about getting to the top of Cusick Mountain, climbing to the top of it. When I got to the top of it, I had 360-degree view just for miles. Like I said, you could see the Seven Devils and the Sawtooths in Idaho, but the entry from 3 days before said backpacked, camped, spent 2 days climbing to the top of this mountain, foggy, rainy, windy, visibility 5 feet. And I thought, oh, that's a bummer. Somebody spent all the time, because it is a pretty good hike or climb to get to the top of this mountain, and to get to the top of it and not have a view would be a bummer. But this is in cultivation, but this is a Townsendia. This is one of the plants I was looking for up there. Townsendias are big daisy flowers on tiny little cushion plants. Makes a really good show. This is actually across the street from Gaiety Hollow. This was another plant that grows at the top of Cusick Mountain, but this is the old blind school. I mentioned doing a sensory garden for blind kids. This is Dryas octopetala variety minor. It's a really good cushion forming plant with these beautiful little anemone-like flowers on it. But unfortunately that was bulldozed when they took down the blind school. Okay, I got enough time to just cover my favorite all-time botanical garden or botanizing place in Oregon. So the Kalmiopsis Wilderness, for reference, this is the California-Oregon border, Siskiyou National Forest. The Klamath Mountains and the Kalmiopsis Wilderness is this area right here. Absolutely one of the most botanically fascinating areas you're going to find anywhere in Oregon. And I've done a number of trips there. I haven't been back there in a while, and I really need to. But I spent, the early 2000s, I would go twice a year down there to look for seeds. So, of course, everybody hopefully knows the story of Kalmiopsis leachiana. Lila Leach was probably a contemporary, I guess, of Ray Berry. They kind of had a little bit of, supposedly they had a little bit of a, what's it called, kind of like a rivalry, because they were both really into plants. And Lila Leach discovered the Kalmiopsis in late 1930s, early 1940s. And what this is actually considered to be a precursor of the rhododendrons. So this is kind of like grandpa rhododendron, like maybe the parent of all the like ericaceous plants. So kalmias, all that. They kind of look at this as like an ancestor, a relic ancestor. So, and it was unknown to science until like the late 30s, late 40s. There's actually population that grows on the Umpqua River area, but really beautiful plant. And the area, the wilderness, is named for it. If you haven't read the book, The Botanist and Her Mule Skinner, it's the story of Lila Leach and her husband. They would basically mule skin into the wilderness to go plant hunting back in the day. Spend like weeks and weeks in the wilderness with a mule pack. So this is the Chetco River Gorge. These photos were taken a long time ago. You really got to see this. It's a pretty brutal hike to get to it, but it is one of the most beautiful river gorges anywhere in Oregon. It's where the Chetco flows through the Kalmiopsis wilderness. So just a little bit about the topography in there. It is brutal, brutal country. There's nothing that's easy hiking. You can just kind of see these peaks go from like 4,000 feet down to like river bottom, and in like 2 miles. So you'll have like a 4,000 foot descent. Pretty brutal. You see there's these mines in here. I'll talk a little bit about that. There's a history of mining in the Kalmiopsis going back to World War II. Backpacking is really the best way to get there. This was a long time ago, but my dog Scooter back in the day, and that's my ex-wife there, we spent a lot of time going way deep into the wilderness, and really the only way you can do that is backpacking. They actually have there's a bunch of rare conifers that grow only in the Kalmiopsis and that Southern Oregon area. And one of the things they're worried about is a Port Orford cedar root rot. And so a lot of the trails, they won't open them until they've completely dried out, because they're worried about the spores spreading on car traffic driving into these trailheads. So that's something to be aware of if you're wanting to check that. There'll be road closures due to the Port Orford cedar root rot, but there's some interesting, if you know the like Indian pipes, like Monotropa, these are hemiparasitic plants. So they're somewhere in between a mushroom and a flowering plant. They're kind of like dividing that line. There's some pretty neat ones. This is Sarcodes sanguinea. It's a weird creature. Penstemon, again, apologize for the pictures. These were old film photos that before the days of digital photography, but Lilium bolanderi is a pretty cool species to run across in there. It's like 6 feet tall, huge lilies, just deep orange, and they're almost like rubbery orange peel textured petals to it. There's a number of kind of rare irises down in there. Here's phlox growing with Iris innominata, one of the smaller ones. Good for rock gardens for sure. The native ginger down there is called Asarum hartwigii. And if you know, like at Gady Hollow, underneath the espaliered sasanquas, we're growing cyclamen. These basically, it's the cyclamen leaf ginger, because it really has these dramatic, it looks like a cyclamen, but it all has these weird brown flowers. That's the wild ginger. So this is one of the weirdest things about the Kalmiopsis is you'll be hiking through there and you'll be like, literally, we gone 30 miles into the wilderness and all of a sudden just pop out into this old steam shovel. Like, no, there's not even a road anymore. There was just a trail to it. And you're like, whoa, how did that get there? Well, I guess in World War II, they were mining chromium in there or something for the war effort. Um, they had, so there's this mining legacy, and you'll run across old mine shafts and weird old equipment just in the middle of the absolute wilderness. And there's like plants growing out of this old machinery. Apparently when they closed down the mines, they just left the machinery and then headed out. But the rhododendron occidentale, this is the western azalea, native azalea, and it's one of the most fragrant, absolutely amazing when you're hiking in there in the late spring, early summer, and these are in bloom. It's just, they're every bit as fragrant as like the some of the more horticultural varieties. Lewisia cotyledon, this is one that's kind of, that area is known for. And this is kind of a sad little picture of one plant. But if anybody's familiar with like Wild Ginger Farm, they're kind of out of Beaver Creek area. These guys have done amazing stuff with Lewisias, and it's a really great wildflower from that area that you can do pretty amazing things with. Red Aviva, that's just a drawing of Red Aviva, the Lewis and Clark's bitter root, pretty well known. This one, Lewisia tweedii, this is taken in my plant collection, but from the Wenatchee Mountains, probably one of the showiest. I have never botanized in the Wenatchees. I want to get there. There's some pretty neat rare plants up there, but it's on my list. Lewisias make really great, some of the native plants. So this is kind of that, talking a little bit about some of the naturescaping stuff to wrap this thing up, and I'll finish up here really quickly. But this is the sensory garden that I had built at the blind school, and the concept was to let kids, visually impaired students, feel their way through the alpine environment by touch or smell or senses. So Lewisias are one of those. They're a succulent leafed, and they're big flowers. They're kind of almost like succulent flowers, so really good from like a tactile, sensory. Try to, for a second, imagine you experience the wonders of like flowers and botany if you were visually impaired. You know, it's a hard position to put yourself into, but try to feel your way through it. This was a really fun project that I enjoyed doing because it forced me to kind of think way outside the realm. And I basically spent a lot of time with my eyes closed, just feeling my way through this garden as I was, building it, with the sole intent was for kids that couldn't see, but would be able to experience stuff like our native wildflowers and in the alpine environment. So, just another plant from down in the Kalmiopsis, Antenaria dioica, the pussy paws as it's called. So just a real quick story to finish this off. And this is one of the great mistakes of my life. I'd say adventures, but it was turned out to be kind of the hellish thing. I call it the Devil's Traverse. I got this wild idea because my ex's family take this trail that hikes and traverses the entire Kalmiopsis and then get picked up by relatives shuttled on the other side. So we're going to hike across the entire thing here. That turned out to be, I almost lost these two as traveling companions on that. You can see the topography. It is just brutal. And you would have to hike, like I said, 4,000 feet down to a river valley and then climb 4,000 feet up. And you'd only gone about 2 miles. And we had 15 miles of this to do. And it ended up being just up and down and brutal. That's the Illinois River there. That's the Chetco River. This is the Illinois River. The Illinois is a Rogue River tributary. And if you're interested in seeing the Kalmiopsis without that brutal kind of Devil's Traverse concept, this is a neat place to see. Pine Flat is an old mining homestead, and it's a pretty good hike in. It's maybe 5 miles from the trailhead. You have to drive out to some pretty backwoods, probably a 20-mile drive into the wilderness, but then it's only a 5-mile hike, and it takes you down to this just beautiful, it was a flat, like people had homesteaded there. And one of the, I didn't get a picture of it, but I really wish I had. Apparently that homestead goes back to the 1800s. All that's left of the house now is an old crumbling like brick foundation and rock foundation. But right next to where you could tell the front door was were 2 perfect clumps of daffodils growing. And I thought, man, they were kind of greenish flowered, so they're probably some wild types. And I thought, those were, somebody hiked, the miners literally hiked those in there back in the 1800s, you know, and they were wanting to add beauty. Here we're going into this area to see all the native wildflower beauties, and it was kind of a stark contrast. I wish I had gotten a good picture of it, but here in this like botanical treasure trove was these 2 clumps of daffodils blooming at this old homestead. But the area was pretty burned out. There was some huge fires down there back in the day that took out a lot of it, but there's still some neat stuff to see. So this is a pretty cool combination to catch in one photo. Darlingtonia californica and then the California lady slipper orchid growing together. So for those of you know, that's a Darlingtonia flower. That's the only pitcher plant, carnivorous pitcher plant that's native west of the Mississippi River. This is the habitat it grows in. You can see the big cobra pitchers here along this creek, and then here's the Darlingtonia, the Cypripedium. There's Western azalea flowers growing right there, and then brewer spruce, some of the rare conifers. So like just in that one little creek drainage, there's a fantastic array of kind of interesting, unusual plants. But that's the California lady slipper orchid growing there. Milkweed, there's some rare milkweeds down there, Calicornis, and I'll finish up here. I realize we're out of time. Another Calicornis from down in that area. I never found it in the wild, but you can cultivate it pretty easy. Calicornis amoenus. It's like a nodding one. I mentioned there's the cat's ears, there's the mariposas, and then there's the nodding ones. They're in those separate subgenre. The only rattlesnake I've ever seen on the west of the Cascades, okay, because I've seen a ton of them on the John Day and the Deschutes River, was this guy. And at the time I had that scooter, that German short-haired pointer, and I had just hiked down to the river, and I took my backpack off. We'd gotten done with this 5-mile hike, and we were looking for a camp spot. I took my backpack off, and I leaned up against this rock, and my dog, the pointer, he was on point. Like I thought he was staring right at me, but you know, he was a bird dog, like gun trained bird dog. Well, he's just locked on point, and it's like staring right at me. And I'm like, what the heck? I look around, there's no birds. Well, as I turn, about 3 feet from my head was this rattlesnake, like at head level. And he just goes like twice. And I thought, oh man, if I had been moving a little bit faster, like it was right at face level. But they're pretty rare to see western rattlesnakes on this side, but you'll see them in the Kalmiopsis. It's an Origeron species from down there, and then the Kalmiopsis. This is when they had those huge fire complexes that burned there. I went in about 2 years later to see the recovery, and this area had been burned, but the Kalmiopsis resprouted. So they're actually really fire adapted, because that's an area that's pretty dry and fire ravaged in the summer. Tritilia hyacinthina, another good bulb. This was one of the beautiful catch flies from there. Silene campanulata, really showy little Silene. We grow a couple Silenes in the garden here. Some more of the irises down there. There's a rare fritillaria down there. I've never seen this one in the wild, and it's on my list. I've grown it in my nursery, Fritillaria glauca. It's a snowmelt species, and it's really ephemeral. So it's one of those ones that you basically have to go early in the season to be able to see it in the wild. Silene hookeri. This is kind of interesting to wrap this into some Lord and Schryver stuff. Lord and Schryver, Ross some time ago gave me a file, and it was purchases made by Lord and Schryver for Sally Bush in the 1930s. And one of the plants that's on that list is this, Silene hookeri, subspecies hookeri. It's known as a very sought after rock garden plant. And of course, again, hopefully everybody can recognize poison oak, right? That plant, I just thought that was kind of interesting. And in that stack of papers from plant orders for Sally Bush was a whole bunch of rock garden plants. So I kind of speculated there had to have been a rock garden at the Bush house at one point, because during that time, 1930s, rock gardening was really pretty popular. Like Leach, if you've been to the Leach Botanical Garden, a big chunk of it is a rock garden. But anyway, just to wrap this up, California Zauschneria, that's along the Rogue River. It's a hummingbird plant. If you want a native plant that blooms in the fall and is a hummingbird plant, this is your plant. This is it in cultivation in my garden. But it blooms in the fall. It'll attract hummingbirds, and it's a great one. This is the kind of habitat along the Rogue River it grows on. If you haven't seen the Rogue River, the bears down there, you want to see bears in Oregon, just go to the Rogue River because they are everywhere, black bears. You have to put your food into a electric fence at night. And I have stories I can tell you about floating the Rogue River. This is right past a big rapid called Blossom Bar. But this guy, Jeremiah, a buddy of mine, I used to do hardwood floors in between gardening jobs, kind of when the economy would be rough. Carpentry is my fallback skill. He owns a hardwood floor company. He'd never seen a bear in the wild before. And we'd just gotten through the biggest rapid on the river. Is called Blossom Bar. It's a very intense rapid. And we're just kind of drifting, sort of celebrating that we're alive. And we come around a corner to see this group of drift boaters. They're throwing everything in their boat as fast as they can, and they jump into it and row away real fast. Well, as we kind of come around the corner, we see why, because there was this mother bear and her cub on that beach. They had stopped right on that beach to have lunch. So Jeremiah was so excited about seeing a bear for the first time ever. He's taking pictures, but he's also the guy on the oars. And so he's rowing. And I wasn't in his boat, but my buddy Alex was. And he didn't realize the boat is drifting closer and closer and closer to the bank. As he's taking pictures, he's not rowing the boat anymore. But all of a sudden the bear starts to kind of bumble down there. And I see Alex, he's leaning back like this in his seat because the boat is literally drifting right towards the bear. He almost planted the boat right on the beach where this mother bear was obviously scrounging around. But the Rogue River is a neat area botanically. There's a trail that goes, you can hike the Rogue River Trail, and there's actually lodges to stay in. You don't have to boat it, but okay, the rest of this talk is all kind of focused on naturescaping, and I guess for the interest of wrapping this up, I'll just kind of real quickly. So everybody knows the Doug fir, right? Did you know that the Doug fir grows all the way down in Chiapas, Mexico? And it also grows all the way up into middle of British Columbia. Like we consider it like a native tree, right? But native to Chiapas, Mexico versus Squamish, British Columbia is two vastly different ecosystems, right? So when I talk about naturescaping and using native plants in gardens, you really kind of have to think about how, what does native mean, right? Because a plant grows in the Wallowa Mountains, that's in Oregon. You say, oh, it's an Oregon native plant. Well, if it grows at the top of Coosac Mountain, 10,000 feet up, facing Hell's Canyon and the Sawtooths, that's a lot different than the iris from Parish Gap, right down the road. So I just talk a little bit about that. This is that silene that Sally Bush had Edith and Elizabeth order for her garden in 1930s. And it's kind of a neat example of like a showy native plant that has its place in a rock garden. If you give this thing too much water, it's going to die. It wants to be bone dry, and it's kind of one of those survivor rock garden plants. But I think it's kind of interesting to look back at those plant orders that Edith and Elizabeth were doing. It's like, oh, they were putting in native rock garden plants for Sally Bush long time ago. So just some of the landscaping I did. That's Lupinus albifrons. It's a native lupin, real silvery foliage. And then this is the California blazing star. So a little bit about using some of those plants from these adventures. And these are Tigridia bulbs. Like this was a bed I designed that took 0 water. In fact, if you watered it at all, you were risking killing those plants. They did not want summer water. So I like to push the limits of that where I could. And having traveled around and seen a lot of these wildflowers in their native habitat, you get a better understanding of what cultivation requirements they want. So yeah, just a little quick wrap up on 2 of our native monkey flowers. You can hybridize these 2. Doesn't ever happen in the wild because Cardinalis is hummingbird pollinated and Lewisii is bee pollinated. But if you mix you can actually hybridize them and you get something weirdly in between. And probably too much to talk about now going into this, but the Pacific Coast hybrids, I kind of use the end of this talk to talk a little bit more about cultivating native plants and some of the adaptations that have made basically better garden plants out of natives. If you just take Silene hookeri of the, like, you know, get seed of it from the wild and try to grow it, it's kind of a hard plant to grow. People have taken those genetics and bred basically better, easier to cultivate native plants. So a little bit about native bulbs, and I'm just going to wrap this up here. If you're really interested in native plants, this is out of date now. I'm sure, like I said, I did this talk 10 years ago, but I'll update. You can look. The Marion SWCD does do a plant sale every year. I don't know what this year holds. This is not at the Portland Expo Center anymore. I don't think. Then maybe there's another location for it, but that's Hortlandia is what this one is known as. And then the Leach Botanical Garden historically did a big fundraiser plant sale every year. And the Silver Falls, I don't know if this one is still going on. We used to go to this one as kids. One of my mom's favorite things to do was to go to Silver Falls on Mother's Day. And they used to do a wildflower festival. So I apologize, this slide may be terribly out of date, but you can look these up and see if some of these are still going on. If you're interested in native plants, these are some great places to look. The nursery guide is the OAN's online source, and you can go on there and you can, basically they have a plant locator. You type in the plant you're looking for, and it will search through all the database of Oregon nurseries to let you know which one might have it. These are a few different ones. Mahonia, obviously, that's John Miller's thing here in Salem. He's a big native plant guy. I think he's the guy that spade dug our oak tree here. So Seven Oaks, really good native nursery. They used to have a $200 minimum order, but, you know, talk to your friends or something. You can get wholesale prices if you go in with somebody, you know. Shampooey. And then I mentioned Wild Ginger. They're a really neat, kind of a rock garden specialty focus nursery. And if you ever get the chance to go see their display gardens, they're absolutely fantastic. So that is going to wrap it up. And if we have any time for questions, sorry, I went a little bit over, but if anybody has any questions, you can shoot them out.